The sun hung high over the azure horizon resort, a flawless diamond in an endless blue sky, casting a brilliant, almost blinding sheen across the water. For the wealthy patrons who dotted the pristine white sand, it was a postcard of paradise. But for one man, standing quietly by a weathered wooden tower, the ocean was never a postcard. It was a living thing, with moods and secrets, and it demanded respect. This man, Samuel Reed, was a single father and a volunteer lifeguard. He was overlooked, dismissed as part of the scenery by the powerful men and women who vacationed here. One of those men was Marcus Sterling, a pharmaceutical CEO whose wealth was as vast as his arrogance. As Sterling barked into his phone, ignoring his 7-year-old son playing near the surf, he couldn't possibly know that his entire world was about to be shattered and then saved by the very man he wouldn't deign to look at. And what happened next? The reaction from this titan of industry after his child was pulled from the jaws of the sea would not just shock the resort. It would expose the rot hiding beneath a veneer of gold and power. Samuel Reed's life was a quiet composition of simple, profound things. It was the smell of coffee in his small, 2-bedroom apartment in the early morning light. It was the weight of his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, leaning against him as they read a book before bed, her soft breathing a gentle rhythm against his chest. It was the worn-out feel of his favorite flannel shirt and the satisfying ache in his muscles after a long day. He wasn't a man defined by what he had, but by what he did and what he was willing to give. His mornings were for Lily, making her breakfast, braiding her hair with a clumsy focus that always made her giggle, and walking her to the school bus stop, where he'd wait until the big yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner. His afternoons, however, were for the sea. He had once commanded the waves from the deck of a Coast Guard cutter, a pararescueman who dropped from helicopters into the churning chaos of ocean storms. He had seen the sea in its most violent furies and had wrestled life back from its cold embrace more times than he could count. But that life, a life of adrenaline and constant deployment, had ended abruptly. The call had come on a stormy night, not from his commanding officer, but from a hospital. His wife, his high school sweetheart, had been in a car accident. He had arrived just in time to say goodbye and to make a promise that he would raise their daughter, that he would always be there for her. So, he had traded the roar of helicopter blades for the gentle hum of a quiet life. He took a simple job doing maintenance for a local property management company, a job that paid the bills and, crucially, allowed him to be home every single night for Lily. The volunteer lifeguard position at the Azure Horizon was a bargain he'd struck with himself. The resort was the jewel of the coastline, a place of staggering luxury that he and Lily could never afford. But the management, after seeing his credentials so impressive they initially thought they were forged, had been more than happy to have him. In exchange for his expert oversight on weekends, he and Lily were given access to the beach. For Lily, it was a world of wonder. For Samuel, it was a way to keep his skills sharp, to honor the part of himself that was hardwired to protect. He never wore a uniform, just a simple pair of red shorts and a whistle around his neck. He was a ghost, a silent guardian that the resort's clientele barely registered. They saw a man with a weathered face and a quiet demeanor and assumed he was just another local, perhaps hired for a pittance. They didn't see the years of training etched into the way he scanned the water, the way his body was always coiled, ready to spring. They didn't see the hero hiding in plain sight. This particular Saturday was like many others. The beach was crowded, a tapestry of colorful umbrellas and designer sunglasses. Samuel stood at his post, his gaze sweeping back and forth in a practiced, rhythmic pattern. Lily was building a magnificent sandcastle near the tower, carefully placing seashells on its turrets. Every few minutes, his eyes would flick to her, a small, instinctive check that was as natural as breathing. Then his gaze would return to the water, to the laughing, splashing children and the adults waiting in the gentle surf. But the ocean was deceptive today. A distant storm, miles offshore, was creating a subtle but powerful undertow. He could feel it in the pull of the tide, see it in the way the waves crested just a little too steeply before breaking. He had already warned a few families, advising them to keep their children in the shallows, his voice calm but firm. Most listened. Some, however, did not. Among the latter was Marcus Sterling. Sterling was a man who moved through the world as if he owned it. He was tall, impeccably dressed even in linen beachwear, and carried with him an aura of untouchable authority. He was the CEO of a pharmaceutical giant, a company whose name was synonymous with breakthrough drugs and, in some circles, ruthless business practices. He was at the resort for a conference, but had brought his family along, a wife who looked perpetually bored and a small, quiet son named Leo. Sterling wasn't relaxing. He was conquering. He strode along the beach with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a sharp, commanding bark that cut through the gentle sounds of the waves. He was negotiating, dominating, and utterly oblivious to the world around him, especially to his son. Leo was a small boy of about 7, with his father's dark hair but none of his sharp-edged confidence. He seemed to exist in a bubble of solitude, trying to get his father's attention with a new shell or a splash in the water, only to be met with an impatient wave of the hand. Samuel watched the boy with a familiar ache in his chest. He saw the loneliness in the child's eyes, a look he worked every day to keep out of his own daughters. He saw Sterling dismiss his son and felt a low burn of contempt. Earlier that day, Sterling had approached the Lifeguard tower, not to ask about the conditions, but to complain. "Is this the best you can do?" Sterling had said, gesturing vaguely at the beach. "I'm paying $2,500 a night for a suite here. You'd think they could afford professional staff, not just volunteers." He had looked Samuel up and down, his eyes lingering on Samuel's faded red shorts and the small, homemade bracelet Lily had woven for him. The disdain was as thick and suffocating as summer humidity. Samuel had met his gaze without flinching. "The water has a strong pull today, sir. I'd recommend your son stays in the shallows, no deeper than his knees." Sterling had scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "I think I can manage my own son, thank you." He had turned and walked away, already raising his phone back to his ear, the conversation about multi-million-dollar acquisitions infinitely more important than the safety of his own child. Now, an hour later, Sterling was pacing near the dunes, deep in another heated call, his back to the ocean. His wife was under a large umbrella, engrossed in a magazine. And Leo, desperate for a moment of his father's attention, had waded out deeper. He was chasing a small, bright red ball, laughing as it bobbed just out of his reach. He was now up to his waist, then his chest. Samuel tensed. He stood up from his relaxed lean against the tower, his entire body now humming with a low-level alarm. He watched Leo take one more step, a step onto a sudden, unseen drop-off carved by the undertow. The boy vanished. One moment he was there, a small figure silhouetted against the bright water. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the sea. There was no scream, just a silent, terrifying disappearance. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. No one else had noticed. Sterling was still yelling into his phone. The sunbathers were still sunbathing. Only Samuel had seen it. The quiet composition of his life shattered into a million pieces, and the man he used to be, the rescuer, came roaring to the surface. He didn't think. He acted. The whistle was at his lips, a series of short, sharp blasts that cut through the lazy beach chatter. Heads turned. Before anyone could even process the alarm, Samuel was already moving. He sprinted across the sand, his feet barely seeming to touch the ground. He moved with a terrifying grace and economy of motion that was utterly at odds with the volunteer persona Sterling had mocked. He hit the water not with a splash, but with a clean, powerful dive, his body a spear aimed at the spot where the boy had disappeared. The cold of the water was a familiar shock. His eyes, already accustomed to the glare, scanned the churning, sandy water. The undertow was a thief, pulling, dragging. He fought against it, his powerful strokes eating up the distance. He saw a flash of red, the boy's shirt. Leo was being dragged out and under, his small body tossed about like a rag doll. He was panicking, his arms flailing, which was the worst possible thing he could do. Samuel reached him in seconds. He didn't grab him from the front. His training took over, a muscle memory forged in 100 real-world rescues. He approached from behind, circling one arm under the boy's armpits and across his chest, locking him in a cross-chest carry that secured the child while keeping his own arms free to swim. "I've got you," Samuel said, his voice a low, calming rumble against the boy's ear. "I've got you. Just hold still." Leo, terrified and choking on seawater, went limp in his arms, his body trembling. Now came the hardest part, the fight back to shore. The same current that had stolen the boy was now fighting to keep him. It was a relentless, invisible monster, pulling them back out to sea. For a man of lesser strength or skill, it would have been a losing battle. But Samuel was not a man of lesser strength. He turned his body, angling it against the rip current, not fighting it head-on, but using his knowledge of the ocean to find the path of least resistance. He kicked with a deep, rhythmic power, his legs churning like pistons. His lungs burned, but it was a familiar fire. He focused on the shore, on the faces that were now a blur of panic and concern. He saw Lily, standing by the tower, her small face pale with worry but her eyes fixed on him, trusting him. That was all the fuel he needed. He broke free of the main current and began the final, grueling swim to the shallows. His arms ached, his body screamed, but he did not slow down. He finally felt sand beneath his feet, and he staggered forward, lifting the boy higher out of the water. He carried Leo onto the beach and laid him gently on the sand, immediately tilting his head to clear his airway. The boy coughed, a violent, racking sound, and spat out a lungful of seawater. He began to cry, a thin, terrified wail that was the most beautiful sound Samuel had ever heard. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mixture of awe and horror. Marcus Sterling had finally dropped his phone. He stood frozen for a second, his face ashen, the color draining from it as he processed the scene. His son, limp and soaking wet, being tended to by the man he had so casually insulted. He stumbled forward, his expensive linen clothes forgotten. His wife was there now, screaming, crying, trying to push through the crowd. Samuel ignored them all. He was focused on the boy, checking his breathing, his responsiveness. He spoke in a low, soothing voice. "You're okay, son. You're safe now. Just breathe for me. That's it. Deep breaths." He could hear the sirens wailing in the distance, the resort staff having called for paramedics, a standard protocol. He stayed with Leo, a shield of calm in the center of a storm of panic, until the medical team arrived and took over. Only then did he stand up, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a profound weariness in its place. He looked up and his eyes met Marcus Sterling's. The crowd parted slightly, creating a silent, charged arena around the two men. On one side stood Samuel, dripping wet, breathing heavily, a humble hero in faded red shorts. On the other stood Marcus Sterling, a titan of industry, his face a canvas of conflicting, unreadable emotions. The entire beach was watching, waiting. They expected gratitude, a tearful embrace, a heartfelt thank you. They expected a father, overwhelmed with relief, to thank the man who had just saved his son's life. If you think that's what happened, you'd be wrong. And what Sterling did next was so cold, so utterly devoid of humanity, that a stunned silence fell over the entire beach. Marcus Sterling stared at Samuel, his eyes sweeping over the dripping, exhausted man who had just pulled his son from a watery grave. The fear on his face was rapidly being replaced by something else, something colder and harder. It was the look of a man whose perfect world had been breached, not by the near tragedy, but by the optics of it. He saw his own negligence reflected in Samuel's heroism, and he couldn't stand it. His wife, a woman named Eleanor, rushed past him and fell to her knees beside Leo, who was now wrapped in a towel and being checked by the paramedics. Her sobs were the only sound in the suffocating silence. Sterling took a deep breath, composing himself, slipping back into the role of CEO, of the man in charge. He walked forward until he was standing directly in front of Samuel. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't say thank you. He reached into the pocket of his linen trousers and pulled out a thick, leather wallet. He extracted a wad of cash, hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars, and held it out to Samuel. "Here," Sterling said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "For your trouble." The gesture was so stunningly inappropriate, so profoundly insulting, that it felt like a physical blow. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. People looked at each other in disbelief. Samuel just stared at the money, then back at Sterling's face. He saw no gratitude there, only a transaction. Sterling was trying to buy his way out of a debt he couldn't comprehend, to reduce an act of life-saving courage to a simple service rendered, a problem to be solved with cash. "I don't want your money," Samuel said, his voice quiet, but carrying a weight that cut through the noise. Sterling's jaw tightened. He was not used to being refused. Don't be a fool. Take it. It's more than you make in a year, I'm sure. The venom in his words was unmistakable. It was a power play, an attempt to re-establish his dominance, to put the volunteer back in his place. Samuel felt a slow, hot anger building in his chest, but he held it in check. He looked past Sterling to where Lily was standing, her eyes wide. He would not lose his dignity in front of his daughter. He shook his head slowly. My service isn't for sale, Mr. Sterling. I'm just glad your son is okay. This, for Sterling, was the final insult. For Samuel to refuse his money was to refuse his power, to reject the very foundation upon which Sterling had built his entire identity. His face contorted into a mask of cold fury. Glad he's okay, he sneered, his voice rising. He wouldn't have been in trouble in the first place if you were doing your job properly. Where were you? Why did you let him go out that far? This is negligence. I pay a fortune to be here, and this is the standard of safety? A volunteer who lets children drown? The accusation was so outrageous, so patently false, that the crowd gasped. Several people who had been sitting nearby and had witnessed the whole thing began to protest. That's not what happened, a woman called out. You were on your phone. You weren't watching him. He warned you. Another man added, pointing at Sterling. We all heard him. He told you the water was dangerous today. Sterling ignored them, his laser-like focus fixed on Samuel. He was creating a new narrative on the spot, one in which he was the victim of shoddy service, not a neglectful father. It was a tactic he likely used in boardrooms to demolish his opponents, and now he was deploying it on a sandy beach against a man who had just saved his child. He turned to the resort manager, a man named Mr. Harrison, who had just arrived on the scene, his face pale and anxious. Harrison, Sterling barked. I want this man fired. Immediately. He is a liability. His presence here is a danger to the guests. I will be speaking to my lawyers about the emotional distress this incident has caused my family. This resort will be hearing from me. Mr. Harrison looked from Sterling's furious face to Samuel's calm, resolute one. Harrison was a man caught in the middle. Sterling was a VVIP guest, the kind of client the resort bent over backwards to please. But Harrison also knew Samuel. He had seen his file. He knew exactly who and what Samuel Reed was. For a moment, he hesitated, the calculus of business warring with basic human decency. Samuel saved him the trouble of choosing. You don't have to fire me, Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice still steady. I quit. He took the whistle from around his neck and held it out to Mr. Harrison. He then turned and walked towards Lily, his back straight, his head held high. He scooped her up into his arms, and she buried her face in his neck, her small arms wrapped tightly around him. He walked away from the scene, away from the money, away from the accusations and the chaos, leaving behind a beach full of stunned witnesses and a powerful man consumed by his own toxic pride. The power dynamic had shifted in a way no one could have predicted. Samuel, by refusing the money and the fight, had claimed a moral high ground that Sterling, with all his wealth, could not touch. But the escalation was far from over. Marcus Sterling was not a man who accepted defeat, especially not a public one. As Samuel and Lily walked away, he was already on his phone again, not to check on his son who was being loaded into an ambulance for observation, but to his head of public relations. He was no longer trying to control a situation. He was preparing for war. And you won't believe the lengths he would go to in order to destroy the reputation of the man who had done nothing but save his son. The walk home was a silent one. Samuel carried Lily the entire way, her light weight a comforting anchor in the storm of the day's events. He could feel her quiet trembling and knew she was processing more than any 8-year-old should have to. When they got back to their small, clean apartment, he set her down on the sofa and knelt in front of her. Are you okay, sweetie? He asked, his voice gentle. Lily looked at him, her brow furrowed with a child's profound sense of injustice. That man was mean, Daddy. You saved his little boy, and he yelled at you. Samuel's heart ached. He had tried to shield her from the ugliness of the world, but sometimes the world refused to cooperate. Yes, he said honestly. Sometimes people who have a lot of money think that makes them right about everything. But it doesn't. What matters is what you did. Did you see me do anything wrong today? She shook her head fiercely. No. You were a hero, like in the stories. A small, weary smile touched Samuel's lips. That's all that matters then. He hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the salty air that still clung to her hair. In that moment, holding his daughter, he knew he had made the right choice. No job, no amount of money, was worth his integrity. But Marcus Sterling was already setting his own plans in motion. From his lavish suite at the Azure Horizon, he orchestrated a campaign. He couldn't stand the thought of the story getting out. The story of the billionaire CEO who was too busy on a call to watch his own son drown. So, he decided to create a different story. His PR team, a ruthless group of spin doctors, began to discreetly contact local media outlets and influential bloggers. They painted a picture of a negligent lifeguard, a volunteer with questionable credentials, whose inattentiveness had led to a terrifying incident. They framed Sterling not as a neglectful father, but as a concerned parent raising alarms about the resort's lax safety standards. The first article appeared online the next morning. It was a small piece on a local news blog, titled "Safety Concerns at Luxury Resort After Near-Drowning Incident." It didn't name Samuel, but it referred to an unqualified volunteer lifeguard and quoted an anonymous source close to the family who described the father's heroic efforts to demand accountability. Samuel saw it when a friend from his maintenance job sent him the link. He read the twisted words and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about protecting a fragile, monstrous ego. The resort manager, Mr. Harrison, called him that afternoon. His voice was strained. "Samuel, I am so sorry. I know what you did. I know what he's doing." "It's okay, Mr. Harrison," Samuel said, his voice tired. "It's not your fault." "It is, in a way," Harrison confessed. "He's threatening a lawsuit that could cripple us. He's a major shareholder in the parent company that owns this resort. He has the board in his pocket. He's demanding we release a statement corroborating his version of events. He wants us to publicly terminate your volunteer agreement for gross negligence." "And will you?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. There was a long, pained silence on the other end of the line. "They're forcing my hand, Samuel. I have a family to think about. But I want you to know, I have a copy of your file, your full record. I'm not going to let him completely destroy you." It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. The next day, the Azure Horizon Resort released a carefully worded statement expressing regret over the incident and announcing a full review of our water safety protocols, starting with the termination of our volunteer program. It was a corporate capitulation, a public sacrifice of a good man to appease a powerful one. The story began to gain traction. Sterling's PR machine was effective. The narrative was shifting. In the court of public opinion, Samuel was slowly being recast from hero to villain. His quiet life was being invaded. Reporters started calling his phone, which he had to turn off. A local news van even parked outside his apartment complex for an hour, hoping for a comment. He felt like a cornered animal. All he had wanted was to do the right thing, to live a peaceful life with his daughter. Now, the world he had so carefully constructed was under attack. But Marcus Sterling had made a critical miscalculation. He assumed everyone was as cynical and easily manipulated as he was. He had forgotten about the witnesses on the beach. He had forgotten about the power of a true story, well told. One of the witnesses was a retired journalist named Arthur Vance. Arthur had spent 40 years working for a major national newspaper, sniffing out corruption and lies. He had seen the entire event unfold, from Sterling's arrogant dismissal of Samuel's warning to his venomous, ungrateful outburst after the rescue. He had watched in disgust as Sterling tried to buy Samuel's silence and then viciously attack his character. Arthur had tried to speak to a few of the local reporters, but they weren't interested. They had their story fed to them by Sterling's PR team. So, Arthur decided to write the story himself. He spent 2 days making calls, tracking down other witnesses. He spoke to the woman who had heard Sterling berate Samuel. He spoke to the man who had confirmed Samuel's warning about the undertow. He even found a teenager who had, by sheer chance, been filming the waves with his phone and had caught the entire rescue and the ugly confrontation after on video. The teenager, intimidated by Sterling's wealth and power, had been too scared to come forward. But with Arthur's encouragement, he agreed to share the footage. While Arthur was gathering his allies, Samuel was gaining one of his own. Eleanor Sterling, Marcus's wife, had been a silent, weeping figure on the beach. But she was not blind, nor was she stupid. She had seen her husband's neglect. She had heard his cruel words. The incident had been a horrifying, clarifying moment for her. For years, she had lived in the shadow of his ambition, making excuses for his coldness, for his obsession with work and status. But seeing him try to destroy the man who saved their son's life was a breaking point. She found Samuel's address through a private investigator, a tool she had at her disposal but rarely used. She arrived at his modest apartment complex in a black town car that looked wildly out of place. She knocked on his door, her hands trembling. When Samuel opened it, he was shocked to see her. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice wary. "Mr. Reed," she began, her voice cracking. I came to apologize. What my husband did, what he is doing, it's monstrous. There are no words." Tears streamed down her face. "You saved my son. You saved my entire world. And he spat on you for it." Samuel saw the genuine anguish in her eyes. This was not a performance. This was a woman whose soul was grieving. He softened. "Please, come in." She sat on his simple sofa, the same one where he had comforted Lily, and she told him everything. She told him about Marcus's obsession with his public image, his pathological fear of appearing weak or at fault. She told him that their son, Leo, had been having nightmares every night. But he wasn't crying about the water. He was crying about the way his father had yelled at the nice man who saved him. "He keeps asking for you," Eleanor said, her voice a whisper. "He wants to thank you. My husband won't allow it. He sees it as an admission of guilt." She looked at Samuel, her eyes pleading. "I will not let him do this to you. I will not let him twist this. I will testify. I will tell everyone what really happened. I don't care what it costs me." In that moment, the tide began to turn. The battle lines were no longer so simple. It wasn't just the rich versus the poor. It was decency versus corruption, truth versus lies. And Samuel, the quiet, unassuming single father, was no longer standing alone. He had allies he never expected. A retired journalist with a nose for truth, a collection of honest eyewitnesses, a brave teenager with a video camera, and the conscience-stricken wife of his tormentor. The stage was being set for a final confrontation, one that would take place not on the beach, but in the glaring, unforgiving spotlight of the public eye. Marcus Sterling thought he had contained the story, but in reality, he had only fanned the flames of a fire that was about to consume him. Arthur Vance's article was a masterpiece of old-school investigative journalism. It wasn't published on a local blog or a fringe website. He called in a favor, one of the last big ones he had, with the editor-in-chief of the national newspaper where he had built his legacy. The story ran on the front page of their Sunday edition, under a headline that was both simple and devastating. "The Hero and the CEO, What Really Happened at the Azure Horizon." The article was a meticulous, blow-by-blow account of the events. It started with a poignant description of Samuel Reed, not as a volunteer, but as a decorated Coast Guard veteran and a devoted single father. It detailed his quiet warnings about the dangerous surf. It then pivoted to Marcus Sterling, painting a stark picture of a man engrossed in his phone calls, willfully ignoring his child. The centerpiece of the article was the rescue itself, described with a breathless, cinematic quality based on the accounts of multiple eyewitnesses. But the most damning part was the aftermath. Arthur quoted the witnesses directly, their words forming a chorus of condemnation against Sterling. He described the callous offer of cash, the false accusations of negligence, and the threats against the resort manager. And then came the bombshell. Embedded in the online version of the article was the video from the teenager's phone. The footage was shaky but clear. It showed Samuel's powerful, efficient rescue. It showed him laying a coughing, crying Leo on the sand. And it captured Marcus Sterling's tirade in all its ugly glory. The audio was undeniable. "I want this man fired," Sterling's voice snarled, clear as a bell. "He is a liability." The story exploded. It was the #1 trending topic on social media within hours. The hashtag Hero Lifeguard trended worldwide. People shared the video with comments of outrage and disgust. The narrative that Sterling's PR team had so carefully constructed was not just dismantled, it was obliterated. The public saw the truth, raw and unfiltered. They saw a humble hero and an arrogant, cruel billionaire. The fallout for Marcus Sterling was immediate and catastrophic. The stock of his pharmaceutical company, Omnipharm, plummeted. The board of directors, who had previously been cowed by his power, were now in open revolt. They were inundated with calls from investors and the public demanding action. The company's brand, built on an image of caring for life, was now inextricably linked to a CEO who showed no care for the man who saved his own son's life. For Samuel, the change was just as swift, but in the opposite direction. He became an overnight folk hero. A crowdfunding page, started by one of the witnesses from the beach, raised over $500,000 for him and Lily in less than 2 days. People from all over the country left messages of support, thanking him for his service, both in the Coast Guard and on that beach. The maintenance company he worked for was flooded with positive calls, and his boss, a good-natured man named Dave, told him to take as much time off as he needed, with full pay. The resort, seeing the direction the wind was blowing, went into full damage control. Mr. Harrison, emboldened by the public support for Samuel, held a press conference. He publicly apologized to Samuel Reed, calling his initial handling of the situation a regrettable error in judgment under pressure from Mr. Sterling. He then went a step further. Mr. Reed is not just a hero, Harrison announced to a bank of cameras. He is one of the most qualified water safety experts in this country. His file includes commendations for heroism from the President and the Department of Homeland Security. We were honored to have him volunteer his time, and we were fools to let him go. He paused for effect. Therefore, the Azure Horizon is proud to offer Mr. Samuel Reed the newly created position of Director of Safety and Emergency Response for our entire chain of resorts, a senior management position with a salary and benefits package befitting his expertise. The job is his, if he'll have it. The offer was stunning. It was vindication on a scale Samuel could never have imagined. But the story wasn't over. The final act of this drama was yet to play out. The board of Omni Farm had called an emergency meeting and had summoned Marcus Sterling to answer for his actions. Simultaneously, Eleanor Sterling had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and making it clear she would be seeking full custody of Leo. The world that Marcus Sterling had built on a foundation of intimidation and arrogance was crumbling around him. The climax arrived not in a boardroom, but in a quiet, unexpected way. Samuel, overwhelmed by the offers and attention, agreed to a single television interview with a respected national journalist. He did it for one reason: to set the record straight in his own words, and then return to his quiet life. He brought Lily with him to the studio, wanting her to see that standing up for the truth was something to be proud of. The interview was powerful in its simplicity. Samuel didn't boast. He didn't rail against Sterling. He simply told the story as it happened, his words carrying the quiet authority of truth. He spoke of his love for his daughter, his respect for the ocean, and his belief that you help someone in trouble, no questions asked. "What do you want people to take away from this?" the journalist asked him. Samuel thought for a moment. That a person's worth isn't measured by their job title or the size of their bank account. It's measured by their character, by how they treat people, especially when they think no one is watching. As the interview aired live across the nation, Eleanor Sterling was watching from a hotel room with her son, Leo. When she saw Samuel on the screen, Leo's face lit up. "It's the nice man," he said. Eleanor picked up the phone and made a call to the television studio. Back in the studio, the journalist received a message in her earpiece. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice filled with a new excitement. "We have a surprise caller for you. It's Eleanor Sterling, and she's with her son, Leo. They'd like to speak with you." They put the call on speaker. Eleanor's voice came through, thick with emotion. "Samuel, we're watching. You are a good man. Thank you is not a big enough word." Then, another, smaller voice piped up. "Mr. Samuel?" It was Leo. "Thank you for saving me. My dad was wrong. You're a real superhero." In that moment, the entire narrative was sealed. The innocent, honest words of a 7-year-old boy cut through all the lies and spin, delivering the final, decisive blow. For Samuel, hearing Leo's voice was the only reward he had ever truly wanted. Tears welled in his eyes as he spoke into his microphone. "You're welcome, Leo. You were very brave." For Marcus Sterling, it was the end. Hearing his own son publicly thank the man he tried to destroy on national television was a humiliation from which he could never recover. The next day, the board of Omni Farm announced his resignation, effective immediately. His downfall was complete, a direct and devastating consequence of his own hubris. He lost his company, his reputation, and his family, all because he could not bring himself to say a simple thank you. In the aftermath, Samuel's life was transformed. He accepted the job offer from the Azure Horizon, not for the money or the status, but because it would provide a secure and happy future for Lily. It meant he could send her to the best schools, give her opportunities he'd only dreamed of, all while doing work he was uniquely qualified for. The crowdfunding money he put into a trust for her education and a donation to a charity for fallen Coast Guard members' families. His life was no longer small or quiet, but it was still built on the same foundation of integrity and love. He was the same man, but now the world saw him for who he truly was. The final, beautiful irony was that by trying to ruin Samuel Reed, Marcus Sterling had inadvertently given him everything. He had revealed the hero hiding in plain sight, and, in doing so, had authored his own spectacular demise. The story of Samuel Reed became a modern fable, a reminder that true power lies not in wealth or influence, but in the quiet courage of a good heart. It's a testament to the fact that character is destiny, and that in the end, the tide always, eventually, turns in favor of the truth. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of simple decency, let us know in the comments, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they just wear faded red shorts and a whistle around their neck.